Welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're going deep into the world of how we feel.
Oh, very interesting.
I know, right? It's way more intricate than we realize, and to guide us through it all, we've got this amazing physiology handout. It's from Dr. Rasha Eldeeb, a total expert in the field, so get ready to have your mind blown.
Sounds fascinating.
It really is. I mean, did you know there are different types of pain fibers? Some are super fast, some are slow.
No.
Yeah, and there's even a condition where you might not feel pain or temperature but can still feel touch. Wild, right?
Absolutely. That's incredible.
We're going to break it all down how those sensory pathways work, look at some cool examples of specific nerves, and even touch on some interesting sensory disorders.
I'm all ears. So where do we start?
Let's start with the basics.
Go.
How does a sensation, any sensation, travel from, say, my fingertip all the way to my brain?
Well, it's all about these special pathways called ascending tracts. They're like sensory highways,
Yeah.
carrying information from every corner of your body up to your brain.
Okay, so think of it like a network of roads carrying important messages.
Yes, precisely. And just like a complex road system, you have some of those tracks for express traffic. Those are the sensations you're aware of. And then others that handle those behind-the-scenes operations, things your body manages without you even realizing it.
Interesting. So like feeling a pinprick versus my body regulating my blood pressure.
Exactly. And each of these tracks is made up of three neurons that work together, sort of like a relay team.
Okay, I like that analogy, a relay team. So who's the first runner?
The first neuron picks up the signal from a receptor, let's say in your skin, and carries it to the spinal cord or brainstem.
Okay, so the first neuron is like the sprinter grabbing the baton. What happens next?
Then the second neuron takes over, crossing to the opposite side of the spinal cord or brainstem and heading up to the thalamus. The thalamus is like a central switching station in the brain.
So the second neuron is more of a middle distance runner, carrying the signal further. Got it. Who brings it home?
The third neuron, it relays the signal from the thalamus to the sensory cortex, and that's where we finally become aware of the sensation.
That's incredible. So it really is like a perfectly choreographed relay race happening in our bodies all the time.
It is, and this is happening for every single sensation we experience.
Wow, that's just amazing. But how does my body know if I'm, petting a puppy or touching a hot stove? How is that information sorted out?
Well, that's where those specialized tracts come in. For instance, the lateral spinothalamic tract, it's responsible for transmitting pain and temperature. And get this, it also carries signals related to sexual pleasure.
Really? Okay, so that's one multi-talented tract.
Right, and to make things even more interesting, it uses two different types of nerve fibers to handle those sensations. We have A delta fibers, they're like those sprinters, carrying signals for sharp pain and cold. And then you have the C fibers, those are more like the marathon runners, responsible for that slow burning pain and heat.
Oh, so like if you touch a hot stove, the A delta fibers give you that instant sharp pain.
Exactly. And then those C fibers come in with that lingering burn, reminding you to keep your hand away.
That's amazing. Our bodies have this built-in alarm system.
Precisely. And just to add another layer of complexity, those first-order neurons, the lateral spinothalamic tract, they actually travel a special pathway called Lissauer's tract within the spinal cord before they connect with the second-order neurons.
It's like taking a detour before merging onto the main highway.
Yeah. And then, alongside this tract, focused on those intense sensations, you also have the ventral spinothalamic tract.
What does that one do?
All about what we call crude touch.
Crude touch, what is that?
Well, imagine you're walking through a crowded room and someone bumps into you. You know there was contact, but you don't necessarily need to pinpoint exactly where they touched you, right?
Right.
That's crude touch. Less about details and more about general awareness of contact.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those times when you need to feel those finer details?
Ah, that's where the gracile and cuneate tracts come in. They're the VIPs of touch, handling fine touch, vibration, pressure, and even proprioception, that sense of where your body is in space.
Wait, are you telling me these tracks are responsible for knowing where my hand is, even when my eyes are closed?
Exactly. They also play a role in something called stereognosis, the ability to recognize objects by touch alone. Like closing your eyes, feeling a key in your hand, you just know it's a key.
Wow, they're pretty impressive.
They are. And these tracts are organized in a very specific way. The gracile tract carries signals from your lower body, and the cuneate tract handles signals from your upper body. Think of them like parallel highways, each carrying detailed information from different regions.
It's amazing how organized everything is.
It is. And just like with the other tracts, these signals eventually make their way up to the brain, forming a major pathway called the medial lemniscus. Think of it as the superhighway carrying all that precise touch and proprioceptive information.
Okay, so we've got the main pathways covered for feeling sensations from the body, but what about our head and neck?
Well, they've got their own dedicated pathways. The trigeminal nerve, also known as cranial nerve V, is the key player there. It's a fascinating nerve because it not only handles sensory input from your face, but it also controls the muscles you use for chewing.
Wait, so the same nerve that lets me feel a kiss on the cheek also helps me chew my food. That's efficient.
It is. The trigeminal nerve has three branches, ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular, each covering a specific area of the face, ensuring sensory input from your entire face.
So once the trigeminal nerve gathers all this data, how does it get to the brain?
Similar to the tracts we talked about earlier, it follows a three-neuron pathway. But what's interesting is that different types of sensations from the face are processed by different specialized areas within the brainstem.
It's like having a dedicated department for each type of sensation.
Precisely. Now, before we move on, I want to touch on this concept called dermatomes. It's really crucial for understanding how sensations are mapped onto our bodies.
Dermatomes. I've heard that word before. What does it mean?
Think of it like your body having designated zones on your skin, each connected to a specific nerve.
So if I feel a sensation on a particular part of my skin, a doctor could use this dermatome map to figure out which nerve is involved.
Exactly. It's like a secret code. It also helps explain a phenomenon called referred pain.
Referred pain.
Yeah, that's when you feel pain in one area, but the source is actually somewhere else entirely. A classic example is people experiencing a heart attack often feel pain in their left arm.
Oh, wow. So the brain can get tricked about where a pain signal is coming from.
Exactly. Because the heart and that part of the left arm share the same spinal nerve root, the brain gets confused.
Wow, that's pretty important to understand.
Definitely. And that's just one way that dermatomes help us decipher those messages from the body. They're so important for diagnosis and treatment.
This is all so incredibly intricate, but it's making me realize how important it is to understand those details. So you mentioned earlier those second-order neurons, the ones crossing over in the spinal cord. What happens to them?
Well, their axons bundle together to form what we call sensory lemnisci. They're like those superhighways in the brainstem, carrying sensory information upwards.
Got it. So all those different sensory inputs are merging onto these major highways. Where do they go?
Towards the thalamus and eventually the cortex, we've got four main lemnisci. First, the spinal lemniscus, carrying signals for pain, temperature, and crude touch.
Okay, and then the trigeminal lemniscus, handling sensations from the face.
Yes. Then there's the medial lemniscus. It's like the VIP lane for fine touch, proprioception, vibration, and pressure. And then we have the lateral lemniscus, which is a bit different because it deals with auditory information.
Wow, so even though we're talking about touch, it's all connected, all our senses working together?
That's right. Ultimately, all this sensory input falls into two main categories: epicritic and protopathic sensations.
Okay, those sound familiar, but can you break them down for me again?
Sure. Epicritic sensations are those fine-tuned, highly localized ones, like being able to tell the difference between silk and sandpaper, or feeling even a tiny temperature change.
So being able to appreciate, say, the coolness of a marble countertop would be an example of an epicritic sensation.
Exactly.
Right.
They are processed in the sensory cortex for detailed perception and discrimination. On the other hand, protopathic sensations, those are much cruder, less localized. They're the extremes of pain and temperature that get me out of here kind of sensations.
Like when you accidentally touch a scorching hot pan, that instant ouch.
Yes. Those are processed mainly in the thalamus. They lack those fine details, but are crucial for alerting us to danger.
It's like our body has a two-tiered system, one for subtle details and one for urgent warnings.
Precisely. It's all part of the remarkable complexity and sophistication of our sensory system.
This is all so fascinating, but I'm curious, what happens when something goes wrong with those sensory pathways? What are some of the sensory disorders that can occur?
That's a great question. Dr. Eldeeb's handout actually gives us some insightful examples. One that stood out to me is called tabes dorsalis. It's a late-stage complication of syphilis.
Oh, wow. Syphilis, that's not something you hear about every day.
No, it's not as common as it used to be. But it can have some serious consequences if it's left untreated.
So what happens in tabes dorsalis?
The bacteria that cause syphilis, they attack the dorsal columns of the spinal cord.
Those are the ones carrying the fibers for fine touch and proprioception, right?
Exactly. And when those fibers are damaged, it leads to a whole cascade of problems.
Like what?
Well, in the early stages, People with tabes dorsalis often experience these incredibly intense stabbing pains. They often shoot through the legs and feet.
Ouch, that sounds awful.
It is. And as the condition progresses, they start to lose their sense of proprioception. They might feel unsteady on their feet or have difficulty with coordination.
So like stumbling or feeling off balance.
Precisely. And they often develop an unusual way of walking called a stamping gait.
Stamping gait, what does that mean?
They lift their legs high and then slam their feet down hard with each step, almost like they're trying to create their own sensory feedback.
Wow, that sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, and it makes everyday activities really challenging. Unfortunately, the symptoms often don't stop there. Tabes dorsalis can also lead to a loss of reflexes, including those controlling bladder and bowel function.
Wow, that's serious. Sounds like it can have a huge impact on someone's life.
It does, and it highlights the importance of understanding and treating syphilis in its early stages to prevent these complications.
This is all so eye-opening. It makes you realize how much we rely on these pathways for our everyday lives.
We really do. And Dr. Eldeeb also mentions another fascinating condition called syringomyelia.
Syringomyelia. I've heard of that, but I don't know what it is.
It involves a fluid-filled cavity called a syrinx forming within the spinal cord. And this cavity can damage the crossing fibers of the spinothalamic tract.
And that's the one for pain and temperature, right?
Exactly. And when those fibers are damaged, it results in what doctors call dissociated sensory loss.
Okay, now you're using big words to make me feel lost again. What does dissociated sensory loss mean?
It means they lose some sensations, but others remain intact. Specifically, they lose pain and temperature sensation in this cape-like distribution over their shoulders and arms.
A cape-like distribution, so like a superhero cape.
Yes, imagine that. But here's the interesting part. They usually retain their sense of fine touch and proprioception.
So they might not feel a pinprick, but they could still feel a gentle touch or know where their arms are in space.
Exactly. It's this very peculiar combination of sensory deficits. And that's what helps doctors differentiate syringomyelia from other conditions.
Oh, this is all so incredibly complex. It makes you realize how much is going on in our bodies that we just don't even think about.
It really is. And it's a testament to the remarkable design of our nervous system, how it processes all this information and allows us to experience the world around us.
It really is. Before we move on, I just want to hear a bit more about what happens when a cutaneous nerve gets cut.
Ah, yes. That's another area where Dr. Eldeeb's handout is fascinating. You might think that a cut nerve means a permanent loss of sensation, but that's not always the case.
Really? There's hope for recovery.
Often, yes. Our bodies are amazing healers, and our nerves, especially those in the peripheral nervous system, can regenerate.
So the severed nerve can actually grow back together.
In a way, yes. It's a complex process, but the nerve cells can sprout new projections called axons, which are guided back to their original targets.
So it's not just random regrowth. There's a system in place to guide those nerve fibers back to the right place.
Exactly. And as those axons regenerate, they're supported by specialized cells called Schwann cells, which help create a supportive environment for them to grow.
That's incredible. So how long does it take? When can someone expect to feel things again after a nerve injury?
It really depends on the severity and location, but typically the first signs of recovery start to appear around 2 months after the injury.
So there's a wait, but eventually feeling can return. That's good news.
It is. And interestingly, the first sensations to return are often those cruder ones, those extremes of temperature and pain.
So like the body is prioritizing those basic warning systems first.
Precisely. It wants to make sure you can respond to potential threats. And then, gradually, those finer, more nuanced sensations come back, like fine touch discrimination or the ability to perceive subtle differences in texture and temperature.
Okay, so it's a gradual process, but our bodies are incredibly resilient.
Absolutely. And that staged recovery process really highlights how plastic our nervous system is. Even after injury, our bodies adapt.
This is all so mind-blowing. It makes me wonder if our sensory systems are so good at filtering information and prioritizing certain sensations, what would happen if they didn't? What if we were just bombarded with every tiny detail, every subtle change all the time?
That is a fascinating question.
It makes you appreciate the job our bodies do processing all that sensory input, helping us focus on what's most important.
I agree. It's a fascinating aspect of how we experience the world. Well, let's delve into those extracranial headaches. Dr. Eldeeb mentions one that's super common, and I bet you've experienced it yourself, tension headaches.
Oh, tension headaches. Those are the worst. It feels like my head's in a vice. Just thinking about deadlines at work can trigger one.
I hear you. Stress is a big trigger, but so are things like poor posture, even eye strain from staring at screens for too long. Basically anything that causes tension in those scalp, neck, and shoulder muscles.
So it's like our bodies are holding on to all that stress in those muscles.
Exactly. And when those muscles tighten up, it can restrict blood flow and put pressure on nerves, and that leads to pain.
That makes sense. So managing stress and taking care of our physical well-being could help prevent those tension headaches.
Definitely. Things like exercise, stretching, and ergonomics, especially if you're at a desk a lot, are key. But tension headaches aren't the only extracranial headache. Sinusitis is another common one, inflammation of the sinuses.
Ugh, sinusitis. I had a sinus infection once. It felt like my face was going to explode.
They can be brutal. When those sinus cavities get inflamed, they put pressure on surrounding tissues, and that pressure can radiate out, causing pain in the forehead, cheeks, even around your eyes.
So it's not just the inflammation itself, but the pressure it creates that's causing the pain.
Exactly. And the location of the pain can often tell you which sinuses are affected. Like, pain in your forehead usually points to inflammation in your frontal sinuses.
It's like our body's giving us a map.
Right. And lastly, we have headaches related to eye problems.
Wait, really? So straining your eyes can give you a headache?
Absolutely.
Ah,
Things like glaucoma, which is increased pressure in your eye, or even just needing glasses, can cause eye strain and lead to headaches.
that's a good reminder to take breaks from screens and get those eye exams.
It is. Taking care of your eye health is important.
This is all so fascinating. I never realized there were so many different types of headaches and causes, both inside and outside the skull.
It shows how interconnected our bodies are, doesn't it?
It really does. And speaking of interconnectedness, you mentioned earlier how our sense of smell can influence our sense of taste, especially when we have a cold. Can you explain that?
Sure. When you eat, it's not just your taste buds at work. Your sense of smell is busy perceiving those aroma compounds released from the food.
You mean those tiny molecules that float up into your nose when you take a bite?
Exactly. They bind to receptors in your olfactory epithelium, the lining of your nasal cavity. Then they trigger signals that travel along the olfactory nerve to your brain.
So it's like our nose is giving us additional information about the food, working alongside the taste buds.
Precisely. Your brain puts those two pieces of information together, from your taste buds and olfactory receptors, to create your perception of flavor.
That makes so much sense. So when we have a cold and our nose is stuffed up, things taste bland because we're missing that aroma input.
Exactly. Like watching a movie with the sound off. You still get something, but not the full experience.
It really makes you appreciate how much smell contributes to taste.
Absolutely. And this connection between smell and taste is just one example of how our senses interact. There's a lot of crosstalk between our visual and auditory systems, too.
Really? So what we see can influence what we hear?
It can. Have you ever noticed how it's easier to understand someone when you can see their lips moving? Especially in a noisy environment.
Oh, definitely.
That's because your brain is integrating those visual cues from their lip movements with the sound of their speech, helping you figure out what they're saying.
Wow. So even though hearing is an auditory sense, what we see can help us hear better.
Exactly. And this kind of sensory integration is happening all the time without us realizing it.
It's incredible how complex and adaptable our brains are.
Absolutely. Speaking of complex and adaptable, remember when we talked about what happens when a cutaneous nerve is cut?
Yeah.
Our bodies have this amazing ability to repair those severed connections.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier, but can we delve into that a bit more?
Absolutely. The recovery process after a cutaneous nerve injury is a testament to your body's ability to regenerate.
Okay, so let's rewind and imagine that a cutaneous nerve in your finger has been cut. What happens right then? What would someone feel?
Well, you would immediately lose all sensation in that area. The connection between the sensory receptors in your finger and your brain is broken, so you're left with numb skin.
Oh, wow. So it's like a complete blackout for sensation in that spot.
Yeah, and that can be pretty disorienting.
I bet. But does that numbness last forever?
Not always. Fortunately, there is hope for recovery in a lot of cases. The peripheral nervous system is actually really good at repairing itself.
So how does a severed nerve actually heal?
Well, it's a multi-step process. It starts with those natural defense mechanisms kicking in. When the nerve is cut, the severed ends retract, and there's inflammation around the area.
Okay, so it's like the body sending out a signal for help.
Exactly. And that inflammation is important because it brings in those immune cells to clear away debris and create a good environment for healing.
So they're getting the area ready for reconstruction.
Yeah, precisely. Once the debris is gone, The nerve cells of those neurons start sprouting new projections called axons.
Those are the things that carry the electrical signals, right?
Yes, and in the peripheral nervous system, those axons can regenerate. They can grow back toward their original targets.
So it's like those nerve cells are reaching out to reconnect.
Exactly. And this regrowth is guided by chemical signals. It's not random.
So there's a map for regrowth.
Exactly. And for even more support, specialized cells called Schwann cells surround those regenerating axons.
And those are the cells that make up the myelin sheath, right? The insulation for the axons.
Yes. They're vital for nerve regeneration in the peripheral nervous system because they create that protective and supportive environment for the axons.
It's amazing. So how long does it take for someone to start feeling again after a nerve injury?
It depends on a lot of factors, but generally speaking, the first signs of recovery start around 2 months after the injury.
Okay, so there's a waiting period.
Yeah, but what's really interesting is that the first sensations to come back are those cruder ones, like temperature and pain.
Oh, so the body's prioritizing those important warning systems again.
Right. It's about being able to respond to potential threats. Then, over time, you get those finer sensations back, things like being able to tell different textures apart.
It's a gradual process, but it's incredible how our bodies can recover.
It is. And it really shows just how adaptable our nervous system is.
This has been so fascinating. It makes you realize how much we rely on our sense of touch, not just for pleasure, but for survival too.
That's right. Touch provides us with information about the world, helps us navigate safely, and allows us to connect with others.
Absolutely. Before we move on, I want to circle back to headaches for a minute. We talked about histamine earlier and how it can contribute to headaches. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. Histamine is involved in a lot of things in the body, but one of its roles is regulating blood flow.
Okay, so how does that tie into headaches?
Well, when histamine is released in your brain, it can cause those blood vessels to dilate or widen. That increases blood flow, which can then put pressure on nearby tissues, leading to pain.
So it's not just those pain receptors being activated, there's a physical change happening with the blood vessels.
Exactly. And this is thought to play a role in different types of headaches, like those related to allergies, cluster headaches, and even migraines.
So managing allergies could be really important for preventing headaches for some people.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of ways to do that, from medication to lifestyle changes.
This has been so informative. It's amazing how something like a headache can be so complex.
It is. It really highlights the interconnectedness of everything in our bodies.
It does. Speaking of interconnectedness, we've been focusing on the body, but what about our heads? We touched on the trigeminal nerve earlier, but what are some other things that can go wrong with sensory perception in our heads specifically?
It really does. It just goes to show you something as common as a headache can have a lot of different causes and factors.
You're telling me. Okay, but let's shift gears for a second and talk about those other fascinating sensory conditions that we were discussing earlier. We were talking about tabes dorsalis, that late-stage complication of syphilis. Can you refresh our memory on that one?
Of course, tabes dorsalis is a really good example of how damage to specific neural pathways can cause some major issues. In this case, the bacteria that cause syphilis, they specifically target the dorsal roots of your spinal cord, especially those in your thoracic and lumbosacral regions.
Okay, and those dorsal roots, they're the ones carrying all those sensory fibers coming from the body, right?
Right, and the bacteria have this weird preference for the larger myelinated fibers. Those are the ones responsible for fine touch, vibration, and proprioception.
Oh, so they're attacking the high-speed internet cables of the nervous system.
That's a perfect analogy. And as those fibers get attacked, it causes inflammation and degeneration. So the flow of sensory information from your lower body to your brain gets disrupted.
So it's like the communication lines between your legs and feet and your brain are cut off.
Exactly. And as things progress, people start to experience all sorts of sensory and motor disturbances.
So what are some of the early signs that something's wrong?
One of the first, and probably the most troubling, is pain. We're talking intense, stabbing pains that shoot through the legs and feet.
That sounds terrible.
It's debilitating, really. And unfortunately, as things get worse, you start to lose those sensations. Touch, vibration, proprioception, all in your lower body.
So you can't feel your legs and feet properly. Does that affect your balance?
Absolutely. It makes walking and balance incredibly difficult. People often describe it as feeling like they're walking on cotton wool. They lose that solid connection with the ground.
I can't even imagine how disorienting that must feel.
It is, and as that loss of proprioception worsens, It often leads to a very specific way of walking that we call the stamping gait.
Stamping gait, you mentioned that earlier. Can you describe it?
Imagine someone lifting their legs really high with each step and then slamming their feet down hard onto the ground.
So they're trying to create their own feedback because they can't feel their legs and feet.
Exactly. It's their way of trying to figure out where their limbs are in space.
Mm.
But unfortunately, that puts a lot of stress on their joints.
Tabes dorsalis sounds really tough to live with.
It really is. It affects people's lives on so many levels. Physically, emotionally, socially.
And I remember you mentioned earlier that it doesn't just affect sensory perception, it can impact movement as well.
That's right. Remember how we talked about those dorsal columns carrying sensory fibers? Well, right next to those are the lateral corticospinal tracts, and they're the ones responsible for our voluntary movements.
Oh, right. Those are the pathways sending signals from the brain to the muscles, telling them what to do.
Exactly. And unfortunately, those pathways can also be damaged in Tabes dorsalis.
So it's a double whammy. Same bacteria, affecting both sensory and motor function.
It is. And that damage to the motor tracts can lead to muscle weakness, particularly in the legs, making it even harder to walk and move around. People often feel this heaviness in their legs, or they might experience their legs just giving way unexpectedly.
Wow, that's really serious.
It is. And it doesn't stop there. Tabes dorsalis can also affect the autonomic nervous system, which controls all those bodily functions we don't usually think about.
Oh, right. Things like heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, temperature regulation, all that behind-the-scenes stuff.
Exactly. And when those autonomic nerves are damaged, it can cause a whole host of other problems.
Like what?
Well, people might start having issues with bladder and bowel control, or they might have problems with sexual function. It can really impact their quality of life.
This is all so important to understand. Tabes dorsalis can affect so much more than just someone's ability to walk and feel.
It really underscores the importance of early detection and treatment for syphilis. Catching it early can prevent those serious complications.
This has been such a sobering but important look at Tabes dorsalis. It really highlights how interconnected our nervous system is and how even something like an infection can have these ripple effects throughout the body.
I agree. It's a reminder that we need to take care of our neurological health.
Well said. You know, this whole deep dive into the world of sensory perception has been incredible. We've learned about sensory highways and those fascinating dermatome maps. We've even talked about how our bodies can repair those severed nerve connections. It's amazing how much we've learned just from Dr. Eldeeb's handout.
I know. Dr. Eldeeb really knows her stuff. She's explained these complex concepts in such a clear and interesting way.
I completely agree. This deep dive has been a great reminder that there's always more to learn about our brains and bodies and how they work together to create our experience of the world. And that even those everyday experiences like touch or a headache are actually pretty extraordinary when you really look at them closely.
Absolutely. It's a world of wonder and discovery.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us, and a huge thanks to Dr. Eldeeb for providing us with such a valuable resource. We encourage you to keep exploring the fascinating world of neuroscience and, as always, never underestimate the power of your senses.